Okay, evening everyone. Welcome to Get Out of Midsomer, a horror in Britain's Empire. This paper is based on my earlier Medium article, and it's really about horror as a commentary device for thinking about the colonial history of rural England or Britain, and it's part memoir as someone who went to spent my early childhood years in the sticks, part historical media inquiry and part speculation. Growing up, it was obvious how the countryside takes up a big space in the British imagination, what poets like William Blake called a green and pleasant land, and also A. Housman referred to Shropshire as the land of lost content, and the countryside almost as like this unspoiled area of the country or regions of the country. So at school in Northamptonshire, in the early 2000s, so at private school as well, my introduction to page poetry, at least, was through the white canon, so the white British literary canon, which I actually grew up to enjoy at least some of it. So one of my favorites is the war poet Rupert Brooke's The Soldier, where at the front during World War One, he is longing for home and the foreign fields that are forever England. On my undergraduate degree, which was also a creative writing course, though filled with English literature modules, we did William Wordsworth's poem Lines Written Above Tintern Abbey as part of this, I guess, thread of lyrical poems about escapism. Furthermore, to Robert Frost, Ted Hughes, Seamus Heaney, Thomas Hardy, and really lots of these white male voices using the natural environment as escapism. I often think about Daffodils as well, also by William Wordsworth. So really a lot of these white men waxing lyrical about escaping to the countryside. To lots of these poets, England was its country and its country was England, which is how I learned it in the school curriculum. And that was pining for a world that doesn't really exist as well. Um, so on Thursday, the 28th of October, 1982, black artists as well as students and teachers made their way to Wolverhampton Polytechnic in the West Midlands for what was dubbed as the first national black art convention in Britain. It was a challenge. It was a challenge to the British art world and art historians who said there was no history in Africa before the arrival of Europeans. Many of these artists were the children of Caribbean arrivals who had come in the 50s and 60s, who had very different experiences to their parents. So one of those people was Ingrid Pollard, whose family had come from Guyana in 1956 and responded to the call for that conference and was one of the few who wasn't a student as well. Pollard, living in London around that time, one of her housemates knew the family of the historian G.M. Trevelyan, who had a large house in the Langdale Valley in the Lake District in the north of England. It was on those excursions into the rural that Pollard began to experiment with art and photography, later combining ideas of race, empire, and the countryside. Pollard's questions around blackness and Englishness in the rural would become the muse for pastoral interlude, five hand-tinted silver prints of black men and black women in a rural scene, from St Andrews in Scotland to the Lake District and other areas as well. So this was exhibited in 1987, and what Pollard did in the late 80s was really trailblazing for a conversation on racism in the countryside that has now become mainstream, including John Garland and Neil Chakraborty's book Rural Racism, and also Corinne Fowler's book The Green Unpleasant Land, and even my own work as well on Empire and Jane Austen. Pollard's questions of racism, rural Britain, and empire were representations of moments amid her enjoyment of the rural, where whiteness would show its face. She'd noticed, for example, white folks staring at her as if she didn't belong there. Things like that. Welsh academic Raymond Williams also looked at the countryside and how it was analysed in English literature, coming up with the term retrospective regret to explain how these novelists and poets would pine for the good old days. He shows that many white people and black folks using the countryside are living in very different realities. I often look to Louisa Adra Parker's work here, and the space is being made by different community interest companies across across England and Scotland. So things like Black Girls Hike, and also Anti-Racist Cumbria, and possibly other places like Black Scottish Adventures as well. And even down in Sussex, there's numbers of organisations that have been popping up ever since 2020. I think the George Floyd murders also did provoke many people across the UK to get their act together. I know many of my colleagues and friends in Stroud, for example, Stroud Against Racism, came out of the George Floyd protest too. So these are people that were motivated by that incident, but their aims have outgrown 2020 as well. So being a black person talking about this, I've often been met with genuine curiousness and denial from both white and black people. I'm shocked that a black person or black lives exist beyond major English cities, and that some of us even like where we live, as this is where I grew up. Additionally, that due to geography and not culture or race, I might possibly have more to say on many of these white rural texts, like the Railway Children, than much of the black British writing that gets celebrated in the mainstream media. Um, that is also often inner city centric. In contrast, I had a wonderful time growing up, doing things like camping, like in Devon and Suffolk, farmers markets in Northants, while also exploring provincial cities like Lichfield in Staffordshire, where my Jamaican grandparents moved to as part of the post-war Caribbean migration. Also, as a child, Stratford upon Avon as well, school trips to Swanage in Dorset, and also Castleton in Derbyshire, and also Anglo-Saxon burial ground, Sutton Hoo in Suffolk. So my conceptualization of blackness then did not come from, I guess, the big inner city hubs like London, although I was aware of them, but the pockets I saw in, I guess, small towns and the countryside. Adjacent to these very leafy experiences, my exposure to popular cultural texts followed that tradition, including things like The Sound of Music, The King and I, and engaging with the landscapes of classic adaptations like Pride and Prejudice, Wuthering Heights, and the BBC's adaptation of George Eliot's Middlemarch with Dorothea Brooke and Edward Casaubon at Lowick Manor. It was only later that after my childhood I began to connect the dots between colonial enslavement and the landscapes I grew up in or grew up around. Corinne Fowler's books, Green and Pleasant Land, and the more recent Our Island Stories, illuminates not only how places just like the ones I navigated as a youth, connected to the lives and deaths of my enslaved ancestors, but how these spaces and places impacted the prospects of white working class landless Britons, where the same landowning classes oppressing agricultural labourers in programmes like Poldark, so based on the Winston Graham books, but also the same ones who enslaved people in the colonies. So it was only as an undergraduate student I started to read all these academic texts. But I sort of knew about some of the stuff from just from talking to people and being out in the world. In Northampton, we have a statue of King Charles II, who was the equivalent of a CEO of the human trafficking slave trading corporation, the Royal Africa Company, while at the same time celebrated for funneling money into the rebuilding of All Saints Church after the Great Fire of Northampton in 1675. As Corinne further writes that the men who worked for the East India Company or who owned plantations were the same ones, often the very same people who encouraged or enclosed common land, for example, like Salsey Forest in Northampton, became MPs and denied ordinary people the vote, who ran cotton factories and copper mines. So this paper today aims to reframe how historical costume dramas have written these people as benevolent entrepreneurs, including the white women in the work of Jane Austen, and show how horror might be a way to connect the present day heritage sites to the colonial past and public audiences in ways TV and film dramas aren't prepared or actually positioned to do. So the lakes, the ornate gardens, the portraits, the landscapes, the wide rooms, and the tall ceilings are a gift to media makers that, when combined with the historical investigation, so the legwork of academia, allow us to write colonial history back into heritage, away from Black trauma so common on screen, as a history of white people, in short. So white supremacy needs scaffolding to maintain people's belief in it. If you're going to perform whiteness, you need that mythology or a story, imagination. You need the simplest version of the idea. One, in the words of Eames from Christopher Nolan's Inception, will grow naturally in the subject's mind. So I think for me, what grows more naturally than fear? Can you scare racism out of people? No, but if you plant a seed deeply enough, there may be something worse than fear. And to me, that is doubt. So if you get the racists to doubt their own racism, then I think we're doing something right within that. Um, so my childhood in the sticks was ice and fire. I experienced the ice of racism, but also the fire of belonging that I don't get from the inner cities. Exposed to the English literature canon as a child, then as a teenager, doing my GCSE English on Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, I later began to think about how we are never told how characters like the Lintons, living at Thrush Cross Grange, made their money. Wuthering Heights is a Gothic novel, largely set in the Yorkshire moors between 1801 and 1802, with flashbacks to the 1770s by the narrator Nellie, well within the years of chattel enslavement. It's a Gothic novel published in 1847 about the impassioned yet toxic love between the main characters Heathcliff, whose supporting character, Mr. Earnshaw, brings back from Liverpool in the 1770s, adopting him. And so that love with Mr. Earnshaw's daughter, Catherine, or Cathy, as she's often referred to. Heathcliff develops a bond with her, their love complicated by his social class and her later marriage to a wealthy Edgar Linton. When Mr. Earnshaw dies, his son Hindley inherits his estate, and Heathcliff is mistreated and effectively abused, ultimately ending with him leaving and years later returning as a wealthy man, seeking revenge. My questions here are more about how the Lintons and Heathcliff got wealthy, while readers of the book and viewers of the adaptations are told to stay with it and just basically just believe, like, just escape, use the escape, just embrace the escapism, basically. So my interest is adaptation rather than the novel, since film and TV makers could have adapted books like this with a more critical lens rather than just to follow the canon. Use your creative license to say other things that the books didn't. So this is set before the slave owners were compensated in the 1830s and years before trading in Africans was abolished. In the 2011 adaptation by Andrea Arnold, Heathcliff is cast as a black actor, or at least a mixed heritage person who will be racialized as black, who Mr. Earnshaw brings back from Liverpool. In a time where many people living in Britain were accumulating large profits, colonial profits, or psychologically divorced from the terror of the plantation, so that all the money was going into one place and all the violence was somewhere else, effectively. So Wuthering Heights' brooding atmosphere, isolated landscape, and talk of ghosts would allow any filmmaker with a bit of historical knowledge to show how the ghosts of slavery or enslavement might meander the landscapes of the Yorkshire moors in readings of white property and ownership, or in the terms of Cheryl Harris's work of the US, whiteness as property in that sense. So in adaptations of Victorian novels, empire and its ties to in-text property are dismissed in favour of generally white escapism. Topics like colonialism don't make good romance stories. Generally, it upsets the so-called like good vibes. For example, in Mansfield Park, Jane Austen dallies with the slave trade, but doesn't go into major detail. But taking the British country estate as a filming location, with empire relegated to the backdrop, it leaves space to speak on the silences that exist. Walking around those estates, I tend to see the rural Caribbean that my grandparents grew up in Grenada, as one example. Charlene White's documentary Empire's Child tracks the ghosts of enslaved people on her family tree on Jamaican plantations in the same way as country estates effectively greenwash the Caribbean, places made by those profits while also erasing the presence like ghosts. Likewise, legal scholar Patricia Williams has found her 2 times great grandmother was enslaved by a Tennessee lawyer called Austin Miller. So in White and Williams's investigations, I witnessed the supernatural silhouettes of oppressor and oppressed. So that hits even closer to home for me, as my name, the Ventour name, shows up in University College London's slave trade compensation records for the parish of St. George's in Grenada, and you would find Ventours there today as well. So in these names, I see whiteness as property to invoke Cheryl Harris. In the lives of my ancestors, and the diligent work of UCL historians is also a history of phantoms and the violence of the economy upheld by enslavers from the lower middle class to aristocrats. So the slave compensation records show how archives may render the voices of enslaved people ghostly. We see the claims of mostly white slave owners, sometimes where they lived, but never really the voices of the enslaved people. Literary critic Saidiya Hartman talks about this and the challenges of finding the human of Black people in slave archives that focus on their status as property. Hartman contends with the ways the arts can lift spirits, animating the groans and cries of the enslaved from the erasure imposed upon them by those who wrote the history books. So my family name shows up in the UCL records, and I could not find the human, but I found the records of accounts and evidence to how nearly 45% of all claims made in the slave compensation scheme were made by women, just like those in Jane Austen's stories as well. So in a time in which historical archives are being deleted, science fiction as well can also be a space to play with narrative and the tropes of narrative as well. For example, in the words of Amanda Ray Prescott, if aliens are interfering with the space-time continuum, it's very obvious that Doctor Who takes a more liberal path in terms of historical fiction, and it's clearly in the alternative history category. In 1814, frost fairs took place across London, which became part of the premise of the episode Thin Ice. The capital city's big freeze-up made the Thames compellingly attractive to ice skaters and performers, which was adapted by writer Sarah Dollard. But this time there was something lurking under the River Thames, aliens. Also, set in 1816, the haunting of the Villa Diodati also shows yet another storyline of extreme weather patterns being used as a plot device, which, while based on historical facts, dubbed the year without summer because volcanic ash covered a lot of the skies. At the Switzerland Villa, the Doctor, then Jodie Whittaker, and her comrades meet authors Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Lord Byron on the night that Mary Shelley was inspired to write Frankenstein, arguably the first science fiction novel in the West as well. Inside, strange things happen, including an encounter with ghosts. The place of Ryan Sinclair, played by Tosin Cole in Villa, and Bill Potts, played by Pearl Mackie in Thin Ice, also offer insights into thinking about the Black presence in the Regency as well. Before more recent campaigns over the whiteness of, I guess, university or school history curriculums, New Who being Doctor Who post 2005, has been doing the work of not only using lesser known histories as a backdrop for alien events, but using the gaps within erasure to expand on the inner worlds that may show up vividly, that may not show up vividly in archives, which certainly came up in Martha Jones's storylines, when she as a Black woman is central to several stories that have later been discussed in the context of Black history and racism as well. Anyway, Fear Her, written by Matthew Graham and aired in 2006, is one I always come back to because it takes something really quite innocent and makes it sinister. So the lonely child, Chloe Webber, has the power to make people disappear just by drawing them. It got me to think about what if we applied that to period dramas, like the letters and the invoices that may have gone between Britain and the Caribbean or the Americas. What if the contents of those invoices came to life, scuttling out of the ink, causing havoc in the countryside, either in the 19th century or more recently today, as those places are still used as heritage sites. So these are just open questions as someone who is creative, but also likes history and the social sciences as well. We might then come to think about films like the US horror Jordan Peele's Get Out, and the very innocentish scene where protagonist Chris Washington takes a photograph of the only other Black guy at a white garden party. That guy had also been reported missing earlier on. And then he takes the photograph and everything stops. He is being brainwashed by this white woman, and it's really a metaphor. Chris is later entangled with his white girlfriend's family sinister plot at their country estate in the middle of nowhere, far from civilization. Um, so this image of Lakeith Stanfield's character Logan is an effect of the sunken place before Chris gets got by whiteness, basically. What got me about this is how easily this allegory or metaphor translates into, I guess, Britain's geographies, from the black men that marry into white families and then forget their culture or have it sort of just absorbed effectively, to workplaces where black colleagues may step on each other to impress the white boss. It's whiteness, whichever context we're dealing with. Um, I think it can go deeper than this as well. So in the countryside, where that image of Chris falling through spaces can be like to black folks being swallowed up by the colonial histories and those spirits of rural estates. So the sunken place doesn't hear our screams, unable to move or speak. It's the whiteness of death that in the countryside leaves us looking for the human in many different ways. Other recent texts, other than Get Out, including Nia DaCosta's Candyman sequel and Alex Garland's Men, show the horror in people and places. Yet, what about objects? And I look here to the more comical and more laid back Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, where the character Dr. Lars Pinfield, played by Northamptonshire comic James Acaster, says that any emotionally charged object can contain a ghost, as long as it's experienced some sort of horrific event. Um, so what if we thought about the objects of colonialism that way, or slave ownership that way? That every object owned and touched by an enslaver can harbour the energy of the plantation, to put it that way. Hollywood has been able to show how racism can be discussed using horror, also to include Lovecraft Country and its talk of chattel enslavement, ghosts impinging on their president, which was Jim Crow, in the American South. But what about Britain? Ghosts in parchment, invoices, a carriage, unseen in the land surrounding these estates, the fields, the lakes, the portraits, the wide rooms, the tall ceilings, apparition enslavers and enslaved, like poltergeists in the basement, angered by white credit. What if the portrait started to move? So the erasure of black voices and thus our humanity speaks to how we were seen as beyond the possibility of human. In his debate on The Exorcist, critic and novelist James Baldwin discusses the absurdity of whiteness, that white people must go to the cinema to see the devil while black people see them on the street, in the police, landlords, housewives, football players, and even drug addicts, and even religious leaders, their politicians, and even in the mirror themselves. The idea of the devil making no other human real. But reflecting on The Exorcist, James Baldwin further also discusses how this ignorance imitates the rabbit in the headlikeness of white America. So the imagery of black people as monsters is uncomfortably familiar. So at this point in the 70s, there were films like Blackula and Blackenstein, made by white folks, showing how Hollywood always had a certain perception of us. In Britain, I would also argue same thing, that on many country estates, walkers and staff alike have a certain perception of black walkers and even black people that work there as well. Black experiences there show us that, for lack of a better term, our murderers come with smiles. But how can we tell the difference between the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real? Is there an importance? Is it important to see the difference there? So my original Medium article took inspiration from Alex Garland's film Men, to think about the countryside as a living, breathing entity. And the film is a commentary on the patriarchal, violent energies that can fill up rooms, spaces, and places, as well as people. So how it's depicted in Men is how I remember it growing up, in the pubs, in the war memorials, village cricket, fates, and country greens, a reproduction of the male gaze, the white male gaze, that can totally swallow us up whole, those viewed as the other. It revisits how white male entitlement to spaces, even in proximity to white women, who have their own set of privileges and associations with terrorizing of black folks and brown folks. So in the horror film, the rural is a character, secondary to Jessie Buckley's Harper Marlowe, depending on the kindness of others. What were white men prepared to do to protect their access to power? Beginning in London with a domestic violence situation, viewers follow Harper's escape to the rural in a secluded village called Cotson in Hertfordshire. Men has Rory Kinnear play about 10 different characters, definitely in the afterlife of James McAvoy in Split. Um, and it's basically an embodiment of the phrase, and I put this in air quotes, all men are the same, or even more critically, men are trash. And the whataboutery, not all men. But Garland's film shows that it really is all men, both the very violent perpetrators on one side of the spectrum, also the ones that see wrongness happening and still say nothing about it. So it is a film that is about male masculinity, and its various forms juxtaposed with the rural calm that we know was a place expanded by colonial profit and violence against not only black people, brown people, and other people of color, but also the white working class as well, with the common land that I talked about earlier, and so forth, and shows like Poldark show as well. Harper rents a small country house to heal, now as a victim survivor of abuse, only then to go to a village where all the men are the same, and the house that she's living in is haunted by patriarchy. So this use of geography is what I would really like to see in films about the slave trade, using country estates to talk about, I guess, the white collar terror of the economy during the 19th century, in the same way Garland does here on patriarchy. Avery Gordon calls this haunting as inheritance. In recent times, although there has been a call out by black viewers to have fewer texts about black trauma following work like 12 Years a Slave, and other slave trade films and police brutality films, I don't think we get that many of these films in proportion to other types of films. But when they do come, when they are made, they are often Oscar bait, and so it may feel like there's loads. So the marketing campaign seems a lot greater. Black cinema is not a genre, but representations of black lives that get taken seriously are often just films, even in 2025, that are stereotypes in that sense. One way to decenter that would be to write stories about the slave trade that focus on the actions of white people and whiteness in Britain, where there aren't many black people around, and really that violence of the economy that was done through the invoices and sort of the mechanisms and what Steve Martineau called the machinery of whiteness there. So horror is better placed to lean on that history. Thousands of entries in the UCL slave trade compensation records. There's about 46,000 entries of the claims. Over the standard Regency romance focused on women's love lives, not how capacity and space to have love was upheld by profits made by enslavement. So black people in Britain today are used to being seen as monsters, as to invoke James Baldwin. And those stories of racism in the sticks, in some cases, are very much in the macabre. So a day trip to the beach could be a potential horror film. Sunday lunch in a village pub, or even walking around a country estate. I didn't know it then, but the way I grew up and doing lots of those things with my Jamaican godmother and my godbrother and my parents was really quite activist on their part in rural Northants. I was none the wiser as a child that these places weren't for us. So the sideways glances, the feelings of unease, and being viewed as abnormal, as monsters that go bump under your bed in white people's imaginations. We are viewed as monsters, upsetting the rural ideal. So what horror is a great place to do is to decenter the visceral images of black pain that we have seen in the American South and the Caribbean, instead putting the focus on writing stories that show the building of Victorian Britain, the making of the private sector, and our modern economy off the backs of enslaved labour and other colonial enterprises, like the East India Company, for example. And for so long, colonialism has not been told from that position of economics, that economic violence, at least on screen, it hasn't. Or there are other perspectives. So the countryside occupies a special place in my heart as someone who grew up in it, although I did not live there. But its place as a green and pleasant land for the wealthy. White Britain is also an ideal place for creatives to think about how there are horror stories to be told about the invoices, the correspondence, and the building of country estates that can help educate people on Britain's history. For most of us who grew up in the UK, our formal schooling probably had very little to do with learning histories of empire as well. And to fully understand it, there are other interpretations and approaches that I think we could take or creatives can take. Um, Jennifer Kent's film, The Nightingale, is a horror film situated around the violence and terror the British inflicted upon not only the indigenous people of Tasmania, but also the Irish women that were sent there, including through rape and sexual assault and other forms of violence. But what The Nightingale does is take us into the site of terror, not where the power really was. So I really want films set in Britain's present or the past that look at the violence done at home in Britain through the economics and the double entry bookkeeping and the drawing of the borders, which are horror stories all done through the pen and not necessarily the sword, in the countryside, but also areas of London like Whitehall, for example. So down to into the halls of government and power, effectively. Um, so my argument with horror films and absentee colonial violence would be challenged by the British government and the so-called war on woke, where they would say I'm rewriting the literary canon in my millennial image, basically. When British heritage organisation, the National Trust, released their report into their properties links with colonialism and enslavement in 2020, 59 Conservative MPs, calling themselves the Common Sense Group, declared a battle for Britain. I wish this was fiction, but this actually happened. It was all in the same year as George Floyd and the COVID outbreak, and it was like this perfect storm of nonsense, all happening at the same time. And the report also prompted many members to provide knee-jerk reactions to pull their £100 subscription fees to the organisation. So at that time in 2020, it showed how many believed that history was there to make them feel comfortable. But what that hit report did is put the countryside in context and tell us basically what is as well. So beginning with the country house then would be to step towards a Black British psychogeography by reframing colonial history as part of the history of white people, told from the Black gaze. So in 1955, a French philosopher called Guy Debord popularized the term psychogeography to describe the study of the specific effects of the geographical environment on the emotions and behaviors of individuals. For those estates, seen as sites of belonging, both a horror interpretation and nostalgic memories are states of being influenced by that collective psychology. Steve McQueen made a film, a 4-hour documentary called Occupied City, about the lives of Dutch Jews in Amsterdam during the Holocaust, and shows how racism can dictate how geographies get earmarked for demolition by the powerful. In the same way, McQueen links the ghosts of the past to the present day sites, many of them now demolished. This film illustrates what could be possible if we thought about how present day heritage sites fit into Victorian adaptations, almost like shadow texts. Basically, how ghosts live in those buildings, imitate how those novels were written in empire's absence, as ghosts of colonial history, dependent on us to suspend all logical belief that empire in these Victorian novels doesn't exist, basically. So the ghost is in the silence of empire. So this film's questions make me think about possible Black British ghost studies, but also Black British hauntology as well. Like how he raises the spectres of the Holocaust through geography, using horror to animate the country house, and slave compensation records would take us into a Black psychogeography that ultimately bends the tropes of how we remember history as well, the past, and relate to it as well, as time is also fluid. So when you go to these big houses, you hear the silences. Um, these buildings are alive to that violence that happened. Mainly for my own benefit, I started to refer to this sensation um, as anthropomorphic whiteness to give words to how historical objects like buildings may be charged with human-made racist energy. So it meshes English literature with critical whiteness studies. And anthropomorphism is a word I learned when I was like 14 in school, learning poetry in class for the first time, where you give the non-human, human behaviors. So it can be like making London speak, or if the sky bellows, where you give basically the non-human traits. So anthropomorphic whiteness, in that sense, where inanimate objects like statues can manifest white racism. Um, in other words, um, so I like to think about colonialism and empire in terms of the closer you are to the source, the less you see. In the UK, we are in the place where the money went. So our experience is of the gloss. But going back to the place my grandparents grew up in, the Caribbean island of Grenada last year, I saw the remnants of that terror. So in some ways, I think about Doctor Who's Weeping Angels. They are still while you're looking at them, and then you blink. So the present is always intruded upon by an ever restless past. There are ancestral spirits influencing us. So in those buildings, the ghosts of the enslaved, are part of the land. So it goes back to psychogeography again. So for white women, especially um, in the colonial afterlife of Jane Austen, who may see these spaces as part of them, as their self, and think it belongs to them. Guy Debord's psychogeography is incredibly useful for making the links between whiteness, gender, and space used to harm people of color, while at the same time showing that my life is also complicated as someone that grew up in close association with rural England. And it's those symbols of Englishness, of the big houses and also the statues and so on. So I bring this back to me here in Northamptonshire. So going back into the autobiographical, but also the historical. Um, as a child of both the town and the countryside, Black people have been in Britain since Roman times. There were Moors from North Africa beyond part of the Roman army, including a division near Hadrian's Wall. Um, but skipping to the year 1205, local researchers in Northants found a mandate from King John to retain the Peter the Saracen, the maker of crossbows, and another with him for the king's service. So the word Saracen was often used to describe someone of North African or Middle Eastern heritage or origin, and or someone who was Muslim as well. We do not know if Peter was a black man, but his existence is the earliest presence of a black person we know of, or a black person, or someone who actually was not white in Northants as well. Um, Later on, there were several enslaved black people and servants to white families from the 16th century onwards. We know there was a black presence in Castle Ashby, Rockingham, Guilsborough, and Gretton out towards Corby. You begin to get a sense for how horror can talk about the local, blending very specific stories with wider social questions. So horror has potential to commentate on the world that we live in as much as it can their white employers, including people like Lady Rockingham, through invoices, checkbooks, and banknotes haunted by whiteness. In 1663, James Chappell went into the service of the Hattons at Kirby Hall in Gretton near Corby. He also followed his employer, Sir Christopher Hatton, to Guernsey in 1670 when he was made governor of the island. On Guernsey, James lived at Cornet Castle with the family, and it was here on the 29th of December 1672 that lightning struck and set the gunpowder alight, starting an explosive fire, and James saved several members of the family. Hatton died in 1706, but in his will left James £20 per year for the rest of his life as well. So that allowed Chappell to settle as a free man in Gretton with his wife Elizabeth, who died in 1704, and then James remarried in 1705 to a Mercy Peach. And it's this marriage that gives scope to another local legend surrounding James Chappell, namely that he became the landlord of the Hatton Arms pub in Gretton, becoming the first black publican in Northamptonshire. Apparently, there's no evidence to corroborate this story, but I found it interesting nonetheless from a creative point of view. Northamptonshire Black History Association uncovered a lot of evidence of black lives in rural Northants in the 16th and 17th centuries, which ultimately would make interesting sites for horror films and TV programs, thinking about the rural as a living, breathing thing. Seeing as the ways debates over the rural Britain today get both sides heated, the experience of racism clashing with the countryside as a place some people think belongs to them, we see the present is always intruded upon by an ever restless past. There are ancestral spirits influencing us, not all of them good. Also the fact that the heritage sector is 90% white and 66% women. White women navigating those sites in the colonial afterlife of Austin is vital when we think about how ancestry and ancestors stay influencing us. Not all of them good as well. Black British horror now has an opportunity to think about their role in, I guess, anti-racist education. I often think about the monsters like the Weeping Angels in Doctor Who that move when you're not looking at them. Seeing as many white folks are never looking at racism dead in the eye, what might a monster like that look like on a country estate where you do find lots of statues everywhere? There are other forces at play: whiteness as death, racism upon the spirit, whiteness and racism working across time, space time. So you've got the sci-fi element there as well. We might think of historical spaces past these energies from places into people. So next time you go into those estates, we might think about how those nice white ladies of the lake, the Karens of the night, so to speak, they might bite you like the Weeping Angels and smile red as well. And thanks very much for listening. And if you liked this talk, I do a lot of work on popular culture and blending pop culture with history and science and sociology and things like that. So I do a lot around Disney, comics, Marvel films. It can be period dramas. I did one paper on Barbie and Marxism. Um, so yeah, and yeah, that's the end of my paper. And thanks very much for listening. And you can stop recording now, Sam, as well.